spent almost 7 years with UNRWA, early in this century, really, during times when UNRWA was under great stress because the Second Intifada broke out in the late part of 2000, a month after I arrived in Gaza. And then you had Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. All of this created a war zone in much of Gaza and the West Bank. So we spent, it was a time in which UNRWA was under a lot of stress. Those years gave me a certain amount of experience with UNRWA, and while the future is never certain, you never know what's going to happen in the future, I am at least reasonably qualified to discuss how things might go, how the future of UNRWA might be determined in the next few years. My time with UNRWA led me to the conclusion that much of what UNRWA was doing required an examination. I saw, particularly I'm an American, I saw the American contributions to UNRWA, which amounted to about 1/3 of the total budget for UNRWA, were reminding me of the saying that if you do the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome, you're likely to be disappointed. And I think that's what happened with the United States during much of the first decade and a half of this century. The United States, and other donors too, but I will focus on the United States because that was my greatest concern, was pretty much unquestionably providing the yearly budget, its contribution to the yearly budget to UNRWA. It was not insisting upon UNRWA doing the sort of things that the Americans really wanted done, which in essence was to try to resolve the Palestine refugee problem and to promote a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The fact that they were simply unquestionably giving the money every year and allowing things not to change struck me as being very dysfunctional. And so when I left UNRWA, after my 7 years or so, I decided to write a paper on what my experience had been and what I thought should change. That paper was done under the sponsorship of a Washington think tank called the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And it was published in 2009. It was quite extensive. It was a very long thing, much longer than the usual publication for the Washington Institute. And it suggested many things that should be done and could be done were the United States to take some action in order to try to achieve the goals that it had set in the Middle East and that it wanted UNRWA to contribute to. Again, the goals being the encouragement of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the ending of the Palestine refugee problem. The paper was published in 2009. Basically, for the next 10 years, roughly, nothing really happened. The new administration had just come in, and it basically had other things it was concerned about, the American administration, the Obama administration, and it took no action really whatsoever to change anything. It was one of these things where you push things down the road that are not causing huge problems. In 2017, after the Trump administration came in, there apparently was an increased push on UNRWA by the Americans to try to get them to try to move in the direction that the Americans were interested in. That is, ending the Palestine refugee problem and promoting peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. At the very beginning of 2018, the administration announced that its efforts to push UNRWA toward these sorts of reforms have been unsuccessful, and it was suspending aid, future aid to UNRWA. They had already contributed about $60 million for 2018. And shortly thereafter, apparently again after having what the Trump administration considered insufficient response from UNRWA, it simply cut aid completely. No one had ever done anything like this before, and it caused great consternation, not only within UNRWA, but also amongst the donor community in general, which provided the funds for UNRWA. As a result, UNRWA was under great stress, and then a few months later, I believe it was May of 2018, the Swiss foreign minister spoke out on UNRWA in ways that were not nearly supportive as they had been in the past, talking about UNRWA perhaps being a part of the problem and not so much a part of the solution. This was really unheard of criticism from Europeans. He also said, as many people have said, that UNRWA tended to focus the Palestinians' view on the, quote, right of return. That is, the idea that every person whom UNRWA has declared to be a refugee should be allowed to return over any objections from Israel to what is now the state of Israel. This did not go over well, of course, with UNRWA, and it did not go well at all. But still, there was no great change except on the American side. The monies that the Americans had taken away, were not contributing anymore, was largely made up by Europeans and Arab countries, primarily Germany and Saudi Arabia. So I think that perhaps the UN felt under pressure, or the UNRWA felt under pressure, but not terribly so. There have been rumors that at least the Saudi contribution might have been conditioned on the idea that UNRWA would change in ways that the Americans had suggested. Whether that's true, I don't know. This has been reported, but not as a direct quote from any official personage. Then we have, as Hillel just described, just in the last couple of months, this really scandalous accusation about the top echelons of UNRWA. That sort of accusation does not really point at any structural problem with UNRWA. It's rather a personnel problem. And it can lead to great embarrassment, but it would not necessarily lead to great change. Still, I think it added to the pressure on UNRWA, and it adds to the bad publicity and the bad view people can have of UNRWA. So I think that right now, we are probably in a situation where UNRWA is under a great deal of stress. And if there is going to ever be a time in which we can change UNRWA, reform UNRWA, have it change its ways, it may well be that now is the time. So it could be that the future of UNRWA will in fact be different from the past of UNRWA, at least the recent past. Well, how would that be? What sort of changes could be made so that the future of UNRWA was different from its past? Perhaps the main change that needs to be made, and that I've argued for over many years, has been to change the definition of a refugee. When UNRWA first began its operations, it had a very loose definition of a refugee, and it included things like, for instance, need. In other words, UNRWA was providing rations to people who were starving. They were providing blankets to people who were freezing. It was very much of a humanitarian organization focused on immediate needs of people in great distress. And so that definition that they used was not difficult. It was not a problem at the time. Even so, UNRWA at that time made great efforts to clarify who was legally a refugee and who was entitled to their services. This involved removing a number of people from the rolls. People who had, perhaps in some cases, used more than one name, so they were getting double rations, people who had died and UNRWA could not establish that they were still alive, things of that nature. And that resulted in a substantial decrease in the number of refugees on UNRWA's rolls. Something like that probably needs to be done again today, because now UNRWA is a very different organization. It's no longer providing immediate relief to people. The amount of UNRWA's budget that goes toward what we would call welfare payments to people who are extremely poor is quite small, about 10%, I think, the last time I checked. Most of UNRWA's expenditures are for education and medical care and other ancillary services. These are basically governmental responsibilities. And there's no particular reason why the UN should be providing governmental services to a particular group of people who UNRWA has now, under their definition, called refugees. This definition issue is a difficult one because the UNRWA definition is quite different from the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees definition. When you look at the people who are considered refugees by UNRWA and compare it to the people who would be refugees under the UNHCR definition, which is the definition that appears in the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees, 1951. The main difference, and the one that would have the greatest impact upon UNRWA operations, is that the UNHCR does not consider someone a refugee who has acquired citizenship in another country. In other words, if you have been a refugee, but then you become a citizen, you can no longer be a refugee. If you can't be a refugee under those definitions, then a very large number of UNRWA's Palestine refugees would not be refugees at all. For instance, in Jordan, approximately, must be about 90% of the people who UNRWA considers Palestine refugees are citizens of Jordan. And they would not be refugees under the UNHCR or the UN Convention terms. So I think that perhaps the first thing would need to be done would be to address this particular issue. And if there is the ability of the donors to change the definition of UNRWA, to make it consistent with every other refugee in the world, that would be a very desirable thing. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should immediately be switched. In other words, the day that the definition changed, you wouldn't expect 1.8 million, roughly, Jordanian, quote, citizen refugees, oxymoronic term, to suddenly become dependent on Jordanian government services. This would have to be a sort of a gradual transfer of responsibility from UNRWA to the Jordanian government. Now, the Jordanian government, of course, has meanwhile said that they don't want to do that, but I think whether or not that's true, I don't really know, but it is the public position of the Jordanian government. But these are things that would have to be done. During the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis in, I think it was 2002, maybe 2001, sorry, 2001, there was a discussion about ending UNRWA. And the proposition was that it would be ended gradually over a 5-year period. And there's no reason why that couldn't be done now, taking into account the fact that the monies that are going to UNRWA would have to be, at least initially, transferred to the new provider of services. In this case, it would be the Jordanian government. I think it would be unfair to suddenly dump 1.8 million people the responsibility for their education, for their health care, for the various other things that the UNRWA does. They do urban planning, they do microfinance loans, things like that. to dump all that on the Jordanian government overnight would not be fair. So I think there would have to be a transition period in which the monies that were coming from or going to UNRWA would be transferred to the Jordanian government. And this is true in the other areas as well. There are certainly some people in Lebanon who have been granted Lebanese citizenship. Some people meaning some Palestine refugees. They were mostly Christian refugees, to be fair. And there have been some also, though the numbers I don't have at all, in Syria. In addition to this, it would be helpful, I think, if UNRWA, in addition to changing its definition of refugee, which is perhaps the most important thing, if it would modify its mandate. The mandate currently is focused on providing governmental services, which, as I've noted, should be transferred, and on providing legal protection to Palestine refugees. In my view, the original purpose of UNRWA was to, not my view, it's what it's stated in their original mission, was to provide relief, which was desperately needed at the time, and to otherwise assist these Palestine refugees. It was relief and resettlement. In other words, to get them back into the economic culture of their societies, from which they have been uprooted by the 1947, 48, 49 war. If that could be done, that would certainly be very helpful. There have been issues also with textbooks. These are things that are not, the amount of difficulty with the UNRWA textbooks is certainly in dispute. There are many writings on this, particularly with regard to the ones that are in use in the Palestinian areas, but also ones in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And each of these would need to be examined. The UNRWA has resisted this on the basis that they want to use the textbooks that are provided by the governments in the countries where they are operating. But there's no particular reason why that would have to be true. The UN has an organization, UNESCO, which is focused on education. And UNESCO could easily review the books that are in use now, make whatever changes are necessary, and reissue them as UNESCO textbooks. And there's absolutely no reason why that couldn't be done. If all of these things were done, I think it would be of great benefit to UNRWA. UNRWA would be back to achieving its original goals of moving people out of refugee status and into citizen status, which in some cases I pointed out they already are. And it would probably result in a overwhelming support of UNRWA's budget, including probably the reintegration of the American contributions to UNRWA. I don't have much else to add on this. I think this is the main things that would have to be done, and I think they could be done. And I think that at the present time, UNRWA is under great stress, and it would be a good time if donors could come together and try to push forward these rational changes that would make UNRWA, once again, fulfilling its original goal of supporting the refugees and moving them out of refugee status, integrating them into the life of the societies where they are. Thank you.
Thank you.